Some people spend their entire lives avoiding a choice, only to discover that the act of not deciding is itself the decision that shapes their destiny. This is one of the quiet lines left by The Decision Checklist by Samkai, a subtle nod to those who have felt lost at a crossroads, agonizing over seemingly small choices that ultimately alter a lifetime. This book doesn't promise a formula for success, nor does it teach how to avoid mistakes. It's more like a gray mirror, reflecting the hazy corners of the mind where people simultaneously want to believe they are in control of everything, yet secretly deceive themselves to avoid facing the fear of failure. This journey isn't for those seeking easy comfort, but for souls brave enough to ask profound questions. How many decisions do we make each day truly stem from free will? How many are the result of habit, prejudice, or invisible pressures from the world around us? If tomorrow all familiar choices suddenly vanished, would each person still be able to recognize themselves through new decisions, or would they get lost in the very labyrinth of their thoughts and fears? Perhaps the most frightening aspect of freedom lies in this. It demands that we take full responsibility for every tiny decision, where sometimes even a single moment of carelessness can open or close an entire lifetime. I started a new day like any other, but an old question always echoed in my mind. Why do people get lost amidst thousands of seemingly insignificant crossroads? I recall my youth, having to choose schools, careers, life partners. Honestly, back then, no one taught me how. It was all guesswork, a bit of intuition, and countless vague pieces of advice. But the older I got, the more I realized those decisions weren't just personal turning points. They forged my life path, shaped my very being, sometimes silently transforming my destiny without me even realizing it. Some chose wrongly and spent a lifetime blaming circumstances. Others were lucky enough to hit their mark, thought themselves brilliant, and deluded themselves with a string of fleeting successes, but deep down, everyone has been stuck in the confusion of choice. I often asked people if they had ever truly thought about their own decision-making process. Most would shake their heads or just recount old, repetitive stories, claiming that decision-making is instinctual, a natural reaction to life, and doesn't need to be learned. Then I looked around and saw that it wasn't just ordinary people who struggled. Even famous leaders, historical figures, had fallen due to wrong decisions. People talk about the executive who refused to sign with a young band, only to regret it for life when that band became legendary. They recall generals who made mistakes, politicians who made historical blunders simply because they trusted their intuition too much or were afraid of responsibility. Each of these stories felt like a slap to my complacency, forcing me to look at myself. What troubled me most was that modern society doesn't teach people how to make decisions. From school to the workplace, we learn many things: math, writing, debating, financial management, even communication and leadership. But rarely does anyone talk about the art of choice. Everyone thinks they know, but in reality, they're just repeating old thought patterns or imitating their predecessors without questioning if it's truly right. In this era, people are swept into a whirlwind of information, reacting and choosing constantly without pausing to reflect. Worse, many are swayed by social pressure, fearing judgment, so they opt for the easiest or safest path, even when they know it's not what they truly want. I began to seek a way out of this vicious cycle. I asked myself how to make every decision, big or small, bring a sense of agency and serenity. The answer, in fact, wasn't in some magical secret. It began when I sat down, opened a notebook, and recorded every thought, every tiny choice throughout the day. That's when I discovered the power of keeping a decision journal. As I wrote, I faced myself, unable to hide my awkwardness or deep-seated conflicts. Each line was an opportunity to examine my mindset, identify the invisible biases and routines that governed my every reaction. Some days, I realized I blamed circumstances whenever I failed. Other times, I was swept away by momentary emotions, making hasty decisions, and then rationalizing that there was no better choice. But if I hadn't recorded them, I would never have seen how often I made the same mistakes, fell into the same psychological traps. That journal helped me peel back the layers of my self-protection, realizing that the greatest deception always comes from within, when we presume we understand everything. I gradually understood that introspection isn't about reminiscing about the past or regretting what's done, but a process of dissecting, scrutinizing, and confronting my true nature when making decisions. In that journey, I learned to identify biases, the blind spots in my thinking that make it easy to rationalize outcomes to protect my ego. When a decision fails, the instinct is to blame bad luck, the situation, or others. But rarely did I dare admit that I myself had chosen wrongly. The habit of journaling and introspection helped me break this cycle. I asked myself, when facing a situation, did I truly analyze all sides or just the tip of the iceberg? Was I trusting fleeting emotions or merely seeking affirmation to reassure myself? Each time I wrote, I reminded myself to be honest, not to deceive myself with a string of ready-made excuses. Growth in thinking begins in moments like these. Gradually, I found I was no longer so afraid when faced with choices, because every decision, big or small, was an opportunity to explore myself more deeply. It wasn't just about choosing right or wrong, but about how I built the courage to master my own life. Someone once said, "A person is truly strong only when they dare to look directly at their own weaknesses." I believe that, and I tell myself every day that the process of introspection, journaling, and acknowledging mistakes is not a sign of weakness, but the foundation for making long-lasting, valuable decisions. Beyond personal introspection, I gradually became deeply aware of the weight of responsibility in each of my choices. I looked around and saw modern society creating a common trend. People easily blame the collective, the system, or circumstances, rather than owning the decisions they've made. In the workplace, endless meetings drag on, people discuss and analyze, and then responsibility somehow dissipates into thin air. The safety of the crowd sometimes becomes a trap, allowing individuals to avoid the consequences of their own choices. But I didn't want to be like that. Perhaps I was haunted by lessons from history, where every major decision bore the indelible mark of individuals who dared to take full responsibility. I once read about an ancient king who enacted a law that anyone who built a weak house would pay with their life, and about ancient soldiers who dared to stand under the arch they themselves had built when removing the scaffolding, demonstrating absolute faith in their own decisions, however extreme. These images instilled in me a strong sense of the inseparable link between the right to decide and personal responsibility. The modern world no longer has such harsh penalties, but the lack of individual accountability still plunges many organizations, businesses, and even nations into crises, simply because everyone thinks, "This isn't my fault." I looked at myself, asking how many times in my life I had avoided a difficult decision simply out of fear of the consequences, or allowed others to choose for me, only to regret later that I hadn't been brave enough to take responsibility. Sometimes the cost of procrastination or avoidance isn't a clear failure, but a series of lost opportunities, a torment when looking back at the past. I realized that some decisions cannot wait until everything is absolutely clear. If I keep waiting for more information, waiting until all risks disappear, I'll only sink deeper into stagnation, losing all motivation to act. This hesitation is like the donkey standing between two piles of hay and a bucket of water, deliberating until it starves and dies of thirst. In business, in management, in family life, I've seen too many people bring failure upon themselves simply because they didn't dare to be decisive. It's true that everyone fears making mistakes, everyone dreads taking responsibility when a decision leads to undesirable consequences. But I've learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's being afraid but still acting. Those who dare to make decisions in difficult times, who dare to face the consequences, even if they might fail, are ultimately the most respected, because they inspire others with their steadfastness, with their personal fortitude. Looking back at myself, there were times when I let fear dominate, allowing the current of events to sweep me along. I told myself everything would be fine if I didn't get too deeply involved. But the more I avoided, the more I felt I was losing control of my life. Only when I learned to proactively take responsibility, dared to say, "I am the one who chose," and dared to accept both the outcomes and consequences, did I truly mature. I set a challenge for myself. For every decision, big or small, ask, if the worst possible outcome occurs, do I have the courage to take responsibility? If the answer was no, I wouldn't allow myself to back down. I started the habit of writing down my feelings, concerns, and fears in my journal whenever I faced a difficult choice. Gradually, I discovered that those negative feelings were only a very small part of the growth process. It was in those moments of uncertain confusion, when no one could confirm what was right, that I learned to listen to my intuition but not to be carried away by emotion. I weighed the pros and cons, asked for advice from experienced people, and ultimately still had to decide for myself, because no one lives my life for me. Personal responsibility is not just a strong declaration. It is a persistent commitment every day, a measure of each person's worth. I understand that a good society can only be built by individuals who dare to take responsibility, and a truly mature person is defined not by age, but by their willingness to bear the consequences of their own decisions. Regardless of the outcome, when I do that, I feel lighter, no longer afraid of failure, no longer filled with regret. Because I know I have lived fully with my own choices. Having moved beyond the stage of daring to take responsibility, I began to realize that I wasn't always tripped up by obviously wrong decisions. Many times, I thought I had considered everything carefully, thought everything was under control, but the outcome was still unexpected. In retrospect, I realized I often fell into psychological traps I wasn't even aware of. This happened when I only focused on what was immediately prominent, overlooking important hidden factors, or unconsciously following the opinions of those in higher positions, losing touch with my inner voice. Once, I witnessed a team fall into the whirlpool of groupthink. Everyone unanimously chose the easy option simply because no one wanted to be the disruptor. That consensus wasn't a display of strength, but a sign of dangerous compromise. I recalled famous psychological experiments where people were willing to harm others simply by following orders from someone perceived as an authority. This made me reflect. Not just individuals, but entire groups can be swept away by cognitive inertia, drifting without anyone realizing they've gone astray. I also found myself stuck in what's called confirmation bias, only seeking information that reinforced my existing beliefs, ignoring warning signs or opposing views. Overconfidence led me to believe I had seen the whole picture, forgetting that what I didn't see was the greatest risk. Repeatedly, I made decisions based on biased data, only to be disappointed when the results weren't as expected. I began to clearly realize that everyone's biggest blind spot isn't a lack of knowledge, but the unwillingness to admit the limits of their own thinking. Only when I humbly looked back, dared to analyze each failure, and dared to ask why I believed in something, did I gradually peel back the layers of silent biases that controlled my every reaction. Keeping a journal that recorded my thought process, reasons for choosing, and emotions at the time of decision-making helped me trace the roots of deep-seated psychological barriers. Some days, I spent hours writing about 3 major past decisions that didn't yield desired results. One by one, I analyzed. Did I perceive the situation comprehensively? Was I swayed by others' opinions? Was I overconfident or simply afraid to confront the more difficult option? It was this honesty with myself, daring to admit I was wrong, that helped me avoid repeating old mistakes. Thanks to this, I also began to build a system of questions for myself. Whenever I had to make a decision, did I truly have enough information? Was I just looking for reasons to convince myself? Had I asked enough people with diverse perspectives or only listened to the most comfortable opinions? I learned that the greatest freedom of humans isn't doing whatever they like, but daring to look directly at the truth, even if that truth is uncomfortable. Psychological barriers aren't easy to remove, but by recognizing them, I could be more cautious each time I faced a choice. I knew when I needed to stop and ask more questions, when to seek counterarguments, and when to remind myself not to let emotions completely override reason. Each day, I gradually felt more at ease in my role as a decision maker. I no longer feared making mistakes because I knew the biggest mistake was not learning from myself. This journey was far from smooth, but it was precisely through these stumbles, these moments of self-questioning, that I grew in my thinking, learning to listen to myself and others more deeply. That is the priceless gift that introspection, taking responsibility, and overcoming cognitive barriers have given me. Every decision, no matter how small, becomes a part of who I am, no longer a pressure but an opportunity to perfect myself. Sometimes I think about those long nights, my mind overflowing with chaotic thoughts about everything that could have happened if I had taken a different turn in life. Everyone, at some point, sits down and looks ahead with uncertainty, wondering how to distinguish the voice of reason from the whispers of fear or the ghosts of the past. In such moments, I realize that without controlling our thoughts, people can easily get lost in the nameless whirlpools of emotion and illusion. I used to believe that the more thoroughly I analyzed, the deeper I delved into data, the more accurate my decisions would be. But that wasn't true. There were times when I viewed things from only a narrow angle, swayed by old experiences, thinking I understood everything. Other times, I let the fear of failure or incomplete memories guide my choices. And looking back, I understood that without a solid thinking system, all those efforts were just repeating circles, over and over again. That's why I became curious about the thinking models that successful people quietly use. I wanted to know why they could calmly face complex situations, remain unwavering amidst public opinion, and always maintain a clear and open perspective. I gradually discovered that it wasn't their innate intelligence that made them superior, but rather that they built a diverse toolkit of thinking, always ready to invert problems, never taking any assumption for granted. I recall a time when I had to face a risky decision. My mind at that moment wanted to choose the safest option immediately. But then I asked myself, if everything were completely opposite, would I still believe in that option? This invert the problem thinking opened up a new perspective for me. Instead of being constrained by fear, I proactively envisioned the worst-case scenario to be ready to accept it. That wasn't pessimism. It was how I taught myself to always ask the second question, not stopping at the surface. I began to practice second-order thinking. Instead of just looking at the direct consequences of a choice, I asked myself what would happen next, and next again. A decision that seems reasonable today, what consequences would it bring a month later, a year later? I realized most people fail not because they lack information, but because they lack the patience to look more than one step ahead. Those who only focus on immediate benefits will sooner or later pay the price for what they didn't foresee. I also learned to question assumptions I thought were self-evident truths. I understood that the map is never the territory. Every diagram, chart, or report is just a simplified version of reality. If I relied too much on data or existing frameworks, I could easily miss unexpected variables outside my predictions. Project glitches and unexpected failures always reminded me, never view the world through a single lens. I practiced probabilistic thinking. In the real world, nothing is absolutely certain. Instead of seeking the perfect solution, I learned to evaluate each option by its probability of success. It was a painful but necessary lesson. There were times when I was decisive, even knowing the chance of failure wasn't small, but as long as I could control the risks and prepare my mindset, I no longer feared stumbling. The more I did, the more I realized that what's called luck is actually the result of hundreds of choices, with probabilities tilted in my favor. I also fell into the paradox of certainty. When I was too confident that I knew everything, I easily ignored contradictory signals, becoming rigid and closed-minded. But in moments when I dared to stop and ask where I might be wrong, I broadened my perspective, welcomed opposing views, and was ready to adjust my strategy when necessary. That's when I felt I truly matured. Each thinking model is like a sharp tool, helping me peel back layers of illusion, identify invisible cognitive traps. I learned to flexibly combine personal experience, others' opinions, and real-world observations to see the true nature of problems. As a result, I rarely got stuck in old patterns, always maintaining a clear-headed, proactive state in all circumstances. Most importantly, I didn't allow myself to be satisfied with a single viewpoint. I reminded myself that only when I diligently turned a problem over and over, daring to ask continuous questions, could I escape the inertia of old thinking and truly get closer to wise choices. The deeper I went on this journey, the freer I felt in my thoughts, no longer afraid of unexpected situations, but seeing them as opportunities to sharpen my intellect and life skills. I still remember a time when, amidst the intertwined choices of life, I asked myself how well I truly understood the limits of my own abilities. That feeling was like standing before a vast ocean, only seeing the flat surface without knowing what lay deep beneath. I realized that many times I had too confidently stepped into unfamiliar waters, thinking that effort alone would be enough. But the truth is, no one can be good at everything, and no one is sharp enough to recognize all their weaknesses without honestly examining themselves every day. I had witnessed so many people around me rush into new fields, thinking they knew enough, only to be disillusioned when things didn't turn out as imagined. I myself had experienced that feeling of failure when embarking on projects beyond my true capabilities, ignoring the advice of experienced individuals. Those falls taught me an important lesson. Only when I knew what I knew and dared to admit what I didn't know could I limit risks and leverage my true strengths. I began to ask myself frank questions. What are the areas where I have diligently trained, experienced enough failures and successes to deeply understand their nature? And what are the areas where I have only touched the surface, knowing only through books or what others told me? Each time I was honest with myself, I saw more clearly the fragile boundary between confidence and illusion, between genuine learning and superficial imitation. I learned to build my own circle of competence, like a personal map. Within that circle, I knew I could rely on my own experience, intuition, and judgment without needing to depend on the opinions of the majority. Outside that circle were areas where I had to be extremely cautious, always asking for advice from those more experienced, verifying every assumption before making major decisions. This way, I gradually avoided foolish failures simply because I didn't know but thought I did. Not everyone dares to live authentically within their limits. Many people, even successful ones, prefer to project an image of being knowledgeable, able to offer opinions on every issue. But true humility isn't about belittling oneself. It's about daring to say, I don't know, when necessary, daring to decline attractive offers that are beyond one's true capabilities. It was this attitude that made me more proactive in learning. I started seeking out people more skilled than myself in other fields, listening, debating, accepting that there were some things I would never have enough time to deeply understand. I no longer feared being judged as incompetent because I understood that a person's greatest value lies not in the quantity of knowledge they possess, but in their ability to recognize what they need to learn next. Thus, I continuously examined, expanded, and updated my circle of competence. Every time I learned something new, I drew a new boundary, but always remained vigilant about the line between true understanding and overconfidence. There were times when I had to stop and admit I wasn't skilled enough to take on a large responsibility or readily delegate tasks to someone more experienced. There's no shame in such honesty. On the contrary, it helped me avoid unnecessary failures. Sustainable success doesn't come from taking on everything, but from focusing on doing best what one deeply understands. The longer I lived, the more I valued depth over superficial knowledge. Looking back at my failures, I was grateful for them because they reminded me, always be vigilant in recognizing limits. Don't let blind confidence become the destroyer of what you've built. This honesty and humility were the foundation that made me safer when making decisions, preventing me from getting drawn into games where I didn't understand the rules. The biggest change came to me not when I read another new book, nor when I attended popular seminars, but at the moment I decided to transform all the insights, experiences, and thinking tools I had learned into concrete actions in real life. I realized that if I kept analyzing, pondering, and deliberating without taking action, all understanding would be like water slipping through my fingers, leaving no mark on my path. I used to spend hours, even days, just turning choices over and over, fearing I would miss something better ahead. That hesitation caused me to miss many opportunities, sometimes turning a small matter into an unnecessarily complex problem. That's why I resolved to build a simple but effective decision-making process for myself, helping me act decisively without being held back by fear and endless doubts. The first step was to clearly define the problem to be solved. Not infrequently, I realized the cause of failure wasn't choosing the wrong option, but misidentifying the core problem from the start. Asking the right questions, peeling back the layers of a situation, saved me time and prevented me from getting bogged down in irrelevant analyses that yielded no real value. Next, I learned to proactively eliminate the influence of negative emotions, time pressure, or imposed opinions from others. I focused on gathering necessary data, consulting people with different perspectives, and being open to critique to better see the blind spots in my own thinking. Once I had enough information, I didn't let myself get caught in the whirlpool of overanalysis. I believed that every decision has an element of uncertainty, and it's decisiveness at the critical moment that determines success or failure. When executing, I didn't expect everything to be perfect from the start. I allowed myself to adjust, experiment, and learn from the results to continuously improve my process. This flexibility helped me avoid feeling like a failure just because a decision didn't yield the desired outcome. I viewed everything as a series of experiments. Each decision was a new step forward, even if sometimes I had to go back to the drawing board. I also learned to control the impact of the environment, group pressure, and public opinion. Situations where everyone rushed into a decision simply because they feared being an outsider often led to unforeseen consequences. I trained myself to stop and think independently before agreeing or disagreeing with an option. This independence helped me maintain my composure, not being swayed by herd mentality or the pressure to please the majority. I realized that practicing decision-making is a never-ending process. The more I acted, the more adept I became at spotting errors, the braver I was in admitting when I was wrong, and the quicker I was to correct mistakes. The process I built not only helped me stay calmer when facing risks, but also laid the foundation for sustainable inner confidence, no longer shaken by life's unexpected twists. The most valuable thing I learned was to accept the outcome, whether good or bad, as a natural part of the growth journey. Instead of blaming myself or agonizing over a decision that didn't go as expected, I focused on analyzing the causes, acknowledging what I did right, and extracting genuine lessons for next time. That serenity helped me feel lighter, more steadfast at every new turn in my life. There are moments when I sit in a quiet room, letting memories drift by, and ask myself what truly makes a person grow after each choice. Throughout my life, I've often felt adrift between success and failure, sometimes joyful, sometimes bitter. But the common thread is how rarely I took the time to look at myself honestly and meticulously. Most people only remember the times they were right, the triumphs that made them proud, while their missteps are hidden or rationalized with flowery words. Sometimes, they even believe the reasons they fabricate. I realized that if I continued to forget or avoid those valuable lessons, I would forever walk in my own shadow. I've seen many successful people hastily attribute all their achievements to intelligence, innate talent, or a bit of divine luck. But few genuinely dissect the process that led to those results. Even fewer dare to admit that today's success might simply be the product of a random sequence of events, and if repeated tomorrow, the outcome might not be the same. There were also times when I failed, but instead of analyzing the true cause, I blamed external circumstances, or fate, only to repeat the same mistakes in a different guise. There's an uncomfortable truth. The human mind tends to protect the ego at all costs, even if it means deceiving oneself. The pain of failure, the shame of making a wrong choice, are often pushed back into memory, replaced by reasons and rationalizations that sound perfectly logical. I realized that if I continued to live like that, I would never grow in my thinking, nor would I ever perfect my decision-making process. Only when I dared to confront, dared to scrutinize every past decision with an honest attitude, did I truly understand what turns I had taken, where I had stumbled, and how I had gotten back up. I started the habit of recording important decisions in my life, not just to preserve them but to look back on later. Each time I reviewed them, I discovered something new about my thinking, about my true motivations at that moment. Sometimes I realized I was influenced by momentary emotions. Other times, I saw that I had trusted others' opinions too much, forgetting to listen to my own intuition. Not infrequently, I was astonished by the shallow reasons I once considered profound, or realized I had ignored clear signals simply because I didn't want to face the truth. Introspection isn't just about regretting or blaming myself for what's past. It's a process of rediscovering thought patterns, identifying blind spots I previously couldn't see. Looking back at the decisions made, I learned to distinguish between outcomes of wise choices, products of sheer luck, and recurring systematic errors. Each time, I understood myself better, knowing where I was prone to falling or how I was caught in cognitive traps. I also began to write down the true motives behind each choice, not just scratching the surface, but digging deep into the hidden emotions, expectations, fears, and ambitions masked by rationality. Sometimes I discovered that a wrong decision didn't stem from a lack of information, but because I lacked the courage to face the fear of loss or failure. This self-awareness gradually changed how I chose later on, helping me minimize self-deception and increase honesty and proactivity in all situations. Documenting and analyzing old decisions also helped me identify personal patterns of failure and success. I no longer viewed every victory as an absolute affirmation of my talent, but saw it as the result of many intertwined factors, both objective and subjective. This made me